My name is Cristina Larrea, and I'm the Director of Agriculture, Food and Sustainability Initiatives at ISD, and it's my pleasure to be one of the moderators of today's session. Just to give you a bit of background on what we do, my colleagues and I, we work across the globe, but in particularly in the Global South to support three things. One, improve transparency and scale sustainability and climate actions in agri-food value chains. Two, help to ensure producers and small-scale enterprises, including women entrepreneurs, have the opportunity to access markets, diversify markets, and meet sustainability requirements. And three, support these actors to have a voice and benefit fairly from their participation in international trade. We do this by leveraging voluntary sustainability initiatives such as certification or standards, as well as policy action. As you may know, in the past 10 years, sustainability due diligence regulations have multiplied, in particular in the Global South, posing challenges to businesses, small-scale enterprises, and especially producers to understand this complex landscape and comply with the corresponding sustainability requirements, as well as to sell their produce with confidence that it's going to go well. Well, in today's webinar, we will unpack for you the main common themes across 12 sustainability due diligence regulations that we have examined recently, highlighting some of the differences between them. We will also explore some of the tools that are available out there to support value chain actors to comply with sustainability regulations. I am very happy to say that for today's session, we have an outstanding lineup of speakers that we will introduce later on, coming from different perspectives and roles, with a very deep expertise and valuable experience in due diligence regulations, as well as supporting businesses understanding how to advance sustainability and knowing about the challenges they face, especially small-scale producers and SMEs. In next slide, please. We're going to see how the session is going to unfold today. So the session is going to have three parts. The first part, we're going to hear about the findings of our research based on a paper that we launched this week, and we're going to share with you in the chat. After, we're going to continue having the dialogue with our guest speakers, and then we're going to have a session of the Q&A where you can engage with all the participants in the session. Through the webinar, we will also have a few moments for you to participate and engage. And we encourage you to write your question in the chat or in the Q&A section. Actually, we are going to start hearing from you. We would like to understand through a small application that we can launch in the next slide, please. As you will see, you can access the question through your QR code or through the link that we're going to copy on the chat. We would like to hear from you. What do you think are the common themes between various due diligence regulations that we have currently in the marketplace? Some examples include the EU Deforestation Regulation, or the Supply Chain German Act, or the UK Modern Slavery Act. What do you think are the common themes between various of these due diligence regulations? If you can share with us one word, two words from the top of your head. Okay. Have we shared the link? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Okay, there is interesting words here: risk assessment, traceability, based on international standards, reporting, transparency, geospatial data, responsible business conduct, human rights due diligence, the OECD framework, sustainability concerns, United Nations guiding principles. Actually, very good inputs from the audience. Thank you so much. I think you are very well informed. We're going to have a very interesting discussion today. Compliance, sustainability concerns. Very good. Thank you for sharing your insights and your thoughts. Excellent. Before passing the word to my colleagues, I would like to thank you, the government of Sweden, for their most valuable support and help us and allow us to work on these critical issues. Now, I would like to introduce to my colleagues Rupal Verma, policy analyst, and Florencia Sarmiento, policy advisor, who will help us making sense of sustainability due diligence regulations across the globe. Rupal and Florencia, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. Next slide, please. So, as already mentioned by Christina, due diligence regulations have gained prominence in the past 2 decades, promoting responsible business conduct and also adherence to human rights and environmental standards. But despite the increasing number of regulations, limited efforts have been made to systematically map out the commonalities, the differences, and the interoperability among them. And this lack of clarity, plus the complex landscape, can hinder effective compliance with the regulations. So to bridge this gap, IASD is exploring these commonalities among selected due diligence regulations, as indicated in the slide. And our ongoing research aims to identify how various tools, such as sustainability standards, can facilitate compliance. All in all, the objective is to make it easier for companies, especially for those operated in developing countries, to navigate this complex regulatory landscape. Next slide, please. Our analysis of the selected due diligence regulations indicated that there are 6 different recurring themes, and we're going to develop each of them in the next slides. Next slide, please. Due diligence operates as a preventative measure to avoid negative environmental and social impacts, and risk management is a central theme in due diligence regulations, emphasizing the need for ongoing vigilance. Companies must continuously monitor for environmental and social risks in their global value chains. And based on our analysis, regulations primarily focus on identifying those risks within the supply chain. But interestingly, many regulations also stress the importance of addressing, mitigating, and preventing these identified risks. Some regulations also go a step further and recognize that it may not be possible to address all the identified risks equally, so they propose prioritizing risks. And some of the examples that are included in the slides are EUDR, which requires companies to conduct risk assessments to comply with the deforestation-free and the legality criteria requirements. And the EUDR calls for risk mitigation. And also the French duty of vigilance law, which requires companies to conduct a risk mapping to identify, analyze, but also prioritize risks related to human rights, health, and environmental impacts. Next slide, please. Another key element is transparency in due diligence regulations, which focuses essentially on the sharing of information about companies' practices. Companies must share details about their policies and the actions taken throughout their value chain. And normally the regulation require companies to make public disclosures or statements. These disclosures should include the steps that they are taking to meet due diligence requirements and demonstrate compliance. Almost all of the regulations that we have mapped include some form of due diligence reporting. And in this sense, companies are required to provide statements, public reports, or vigilance plans that showcase and indicate the practices and measures that are being taken to address the risks that are targeted by each of the regulations. Next slide, please. And another element that was mentioned in the EC retro that we shared is traceability. What do we mean by traceability? It often refers to the ability to track products and inputs throughout the entire value chain from origin to end use. Some regulations, for example, require the company to conduct a supply chain mapping, which provides a complete overview of all the entities that are involved at every level of the supply chain. Companies must document and share detailed information about the products, for instance, origin, processing, and movement. But it's important to note that the information requirements, the data entry points, vary in the different regulations. But all in all, effective traceability, what it does is to enhance the visibility of all the actors in the value chain, ensuring accountability and transparency, which are other elements, recurring elements. Examples include EUDR, and in this case, the data information to be shared is geolocation of the relevant plots of the land to trace the exact production location and ensuring compliance with the deforestation-free criteria. And another example is the Swiss Ordinance on Due Diligence and Transparency in relation to minerals and metals that requires to establish a supply chain traceability system for documenting, for example, key details, including a description of the product, trade names, supplying information, country of origin, among others. With this, I will give the floor to my colleague Rupal, who will introduce you to the rest of the recurring themes. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Florencia. We can start with the next ones. Next slide, please. So the next theme that we discovered was more recurring was legality, in the sense that most regulations required businesses or whoever wants to comply with the regulation to meet national laws and standards, the ones that relate to the specific risk that the regulation aims to address and most often applicable in the country of production or where the business is happening. Prominent examples of that would be the EUDR, which has a very strong legality component whereby the operators or traders really need to prove compliance with laws of country of production, and these could include land rights, environmental rights, forest regulations, and anti-corruption laws. Another example is the German Supply Chain Act, the acronym of the LKSG, which is more popular, which requires respect for international human rights and standards, all of those mentioned in the annex of the regulation. And these include the ILO conventions, the Minamata Convention on Mercury, and Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Next slide, please. Another common theme, and not so unsurprisingly, we found out stakeholder engagement was a relatively strong component, and this comes across also because due diligence needs to be informed by stakeholder engagement, and the two ways that in which it most commonly occurred was, of course, the timely sharing of information that businesses need to do with relevant stakeholders, but more so in an accessible and meaningful format, and also the other way in which stakeholders could engage in all the due diligence processes, the steps throughout the steps that are envisioned in the regulations, also in a meaningful way. The examples of this would be the recently adopted Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, wherein meaningful engagement is required at all steps of due diligence, but most importantly in identification of risks and establishing mitigation measures. Another one would be the LDV, which is the acronym for the French Duty of Vigilance, where there's a very strong component of stakeholder engagement in making the risk mitigation plan, but also it really mandates having the alert mechanism developed with the union representatives to collect information on risks. Next slide, please. Lastly, we found out accountability, also again unsurprisingly, as a recurring theme. This was built through most of the components that we have discussed up until now. However, regulations really went a step ahead in establishing accountability, some of them assigning responsibilities to individuals to conduct due diligence, so holding someone accountable, mandating internal audits, supplier certifications, and beyond that, all of the regulations that we assessed, there are some that did not, but 90% of them had enforcement mechanisms and also had consequences for non-compliance, which meant that if you do not comply, then there were some penalties or even market exclusion that the businesses could face. Examples of that would be the German supply chain regulation, where accountability mechanisms such as internal and external complaint procedures need to be established in order to comply, and the very popular EUDR, where due diligence statement establishes accountability. But beyond that, also both of these have penalties and even fines and exclusion in case of non-compliance. Next slide, please. So with all of that, our aim was also to try to uncover a bit of how businesses can comply with all these due diligence regulations that are popping up. Next slide, please. We kind of uncovered that there is this due diligence soup, none of which neither of us really like to drink, but it causes a lot of challenges. It causes a lot of confusion because there's so many themes. There's, even after we do some uncovering of commonalities, there's still so many things that remain unsaid, undone. But we also found out that there are a lot of people who are developing tools, developing mechanisms, methods that can help guide compliance. Some of them were focusing on mapping forest areas through satellite imagery, like WISP, which we will hear later about. There were others like Satelligence, which had really satellite imagery focus. Others were helping establishing traceability, like Coltiva, and the ones there were others that help risk management, like the SEDEX radar tool. Next slide, please. However, what caught our attention most was this proposal for smart mix that most stakeholders were advocating for. And this really reflects to have a complementarity between public and private measures, not just for compliance, but in order to further sustainability in a broader sense. And one such largely private tool that we in the SSI have been working with for very long are the voluntary sustainability standards. For those of you who may not be very well aware of what they are, as the name suggests, they are voluntary in nature. They have some requirements, sustainability related, that need to be met in order to comply. But they often now take more a holistic approach or a systems approach, where they also have very strong or relatively strong audit mechanisms. They have capacity building programs for producers. They help in learning the producers about sustainability practices and so on and so forth. So we wanted to uncover a bit of how they can help support compliance. Next slide, please. Through a preliminary analysis and also seeing the literature that is now emerging on this topic, we kind of understood that there are these 5 ways in which very straightforwardly voluntary sustainability standards can support compliance. Of course, they can help with risk management because they have requirements that relate to social and environmental practices. They can provide transparency because they usually have public audit reports and also public reporting requirements. They can support traceability through their mechanisms. Most of them require segregation of certified and non-certified material. They can enhance accountability because they have audit mechanisms, assurance systems, and some of them can also support legality because most of them are they have requirements which are really based on international treaties and conventions. Next slide, please. And they keep evolving. The big ones that we are seeing as a trend now is that they are responding to these market realities. 2 examples that you can see here is the FSC GIS portal and the RSPO hotspot hub, which really can be used to check the risk of deforestation. But what we also would like to really caution and use as a word of advice for now is that, of course, voluntary sustainability standards have been there for very long, but a business or an operator really needs to make sure that they are using the right standard for complying with the right component of the due diligence regulation that is needed. It needs to be assessed whether the standard is strong enough, has really strict audit mechanisms, what kind of transparency it has, and many other components. And this is also part of work that we will keep on developing going further. Next slide, please. Which very well brings us to the last slide. What goes ahead, what comes next following this preliminary work that we have introduced in this webinar. So of course, we will continue to develop this tool, the one where we have analyzed selected due diligence regulations and trying to see the commonalities, but also in that sense, bring up the differences between the requirements of these regulations. We will try to highlight the key or the useful tools or the tools that can be used and easy to access to comply with these regulations. But a lot of our focus going forward will also be on uncovering interoperability, which is trying to understand the tools that are already available, like standards, how can their systems, how can their data sharing mechanisms, how can their already existing requirements in place help comply with due diligence regulations and not reinventing the wheel. Next slide, please. With that, thank you so much. We now move on to the more interesting and exciting part of the discussion, where you don't listen only from us, but from experts. And I hand now the floor to Florentia to lead us with the panel discussion.
Thank you, Rupal. Indeed, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers who will be sharing valuable insights from different perspectives. We have Matthew Howard with us from the European Parliament, Valentina Bolognesi from M40, Patrick Ouzu from Asunafo Cocoa Farmers, Remy Annunzio from FAO, and Christopher Schwartz from South Pole. And thank you all for joining us. I'll be starting with Matthew Hogarth, and I ask those in the audience that if you have questions during the presentation, don't hesitate to write them in the chat, and we can address them during the Q&A. Matthew is a senior policy advisor at the European Parliament to Lara Walters, the MEP negotiator of CSDDD, CSRD, and gender equality on company boards. And he has experience in both the European Parliament and public affairs. So Matthew, we've been discussing how there is a proliferation of regulations, but limited efforts to map out these commonalities and differences. So it would be interesting to understand whether from a policy perspective, common themes are considered when negotiating and drafting these due diligence regulations. And based on your experience, would that align with what we just discussed and presented?
Yeah, first of all, I do hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah,
Delighted to join you today, and thank you very much for the invite. As you said, I work for Lara Walters, who is the rapporteur or the lead negotiator for the European Parliament on the CSDDD, which means that my role was leading the technical negotiations on behalf of the European Parliament. So going through every single article, see it into my mind when we were negotiating with the member states. And absolutely, at technical level, I think one of the biggest challenges that we had was there was a clear call for consistency and to avoid duplication. At the same time, we do really believe that the CSDDD brings some added value, but we needed to make sure that it didn't overlap. And that was extremely technically challenging because you actually have, I would say, 3 different categories we were considering of existing legislation and tools out there in the European Union. First of all, you've got sectoral legislation. There's the Conflict Minerals Directive. And then under negotiation at the same time, we had both the batteries regulation and the deforestation regulation that you've mentioned. Then you've got more, let's say, issue-based legislation. I'm thinking things like the UK Modern Slavery Act and the Dutch Child Labour Act. And then on top of that, you already had legislation in France and Germany on corporate due diligence itself. And those took quite different approaches, so it wasn't possible to make it fully compatible between those two. So I think understandable that it was clear that nobody wanted us to duplicate what was already out there. Luckily, on the perspective of deforestation and batteries, because they were under negotiation in the same time frame, we were able to work very closely with the respective teams who were working on those negotiations. But I think more importantly, we had an equally clear call from business and civil society to not reinvent the wheel and to essentially look at the OECD multinational guidelines and the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. The message was, this isn't broken, so don't try and fix it. Obviously, translating that into hard law with legal consequences, including civil liability, meant that it's not possible to simply take them completely, but we tried to stay broadly within that framework. And yeah, as I said before, wasn't possible to marry the French approach and the German approach. But in any case, I think it's really important to note from your presentation that both the German Lieferkettengesetz and the French Loi de Vigilance will be superseded by the new legislation. I know that in Germany, the Lieferkettengesetz will be amended. For France, I don't know whether they will simply replace the Loi de Vigilance or whether they will amend that. But in any case, they will be brought into line. And I think now is a question of, how do you look forward at this point? We're seeing a lot of unilateral instruments in this field. And obviously a lot of eyes now turning to the idea of a UN binding treaty with the negotiating round coming up in the next couple of months. But that process seems to be stalling. I think from a European Union perspective, or certainly from the perspective of Lara, we would like to see a more global framework and more consistency. But in the absence of that, unilateral action is perfectly justified. I think the key question is, try and make it as consistent as possible and try to operate within the best practices at an international level. And hopefully what we've created with the CSDDD is somewhat of a gold standard. We talk in Brussels sometimes of a Brussels effect. This has happened with data protection and the GDPR, where GDPR set the sort of standard that is now being the sort of standard for compliance globally. And certainly if that was the direction travel with the CSDDD, we'd be delighted if that emerged over the coming years.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Super interesting points, in particular, this tension between adding value, but not overlapping with what's existing. And I think it's interesting to know that from a policy perspective, it's not starting from scratch, but rather rely on what is out there to try to bring a bit more consistency and perhaps eventually move forward to like a more universal framework. So, I mean, very interesting point to hear that even if the German and the French approach were different, this will be superseded by the CSDDD. So it's a huge effort. So now that we heard from the policy perspective, perhaps I can turn to Valentina Bolognesi from Amfori to listen more from the company's perspective. Valentina is a senior advocacy and engagement advisor at Amfori, where she contributes to the company's advocacy work in social sustainability and supply chain policies, with a special focus on human rights due diligence. Valentina, based on your work and your members' experience, how do you perceive the value of these regulations for the companies you work with? And how are companies navigating this complex puzzle of regulations?
Thank you so much, first and foremost, for the invitation. It is really a pleasure for me to be here, and also congratulations on I think, a very important publication that will help businesses, but also stakeholders at large to really understand the interlinkage between the different pieces of the regulatory puzzle. So at Amfori, we are a business association. Just maybe for those who might not be familiar with the organization I work for, this means that we represent businesses. We have 2,400 of them in our membership portfolio, and we have been working as an organization on supply chain due diligence matters for a number of years, supporting companies to do due diligence voluntarily, from risk assessment all the way through to remediation. I think, building on what Matthew said earlier, I think the value that I see first and foremost when it comes to those laws is that CSDDD, or also the German Supply Chain Act, but also the French duty of vigilance law more loosely, they really build on relevant international standards on due diligence. So Matthew talked about the OECD and many guidelines. I think we can mention also the UNGPs. Those instruments have really set out the framework of what it means to do due diligence. And there have been companies that have been utilizing those standards to do due diligence voluntarily, even before legislation emerged. So I think it's an important reminder of the relevance of those standards, but it also means that, you know, for companies that have been doing this work already, this should work as a competitive advantage. So I think for the front runners, it's a reminder that they are on a good path to meet for coming legislation. So also to help navigate the puzzle, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What is it that those laws ultimately want of companies? They really want them to engage with suppliers along the supply chains to understand how they connect, to then take action. And I think those that have been doing this voluntarily will be at the front front action of meeting forthcoming regulatory requirements. I think what those laws hopefully will do, they will also level the playing field, and they will bring harmonization, so that there is expectation that this will be one of the key outcomes of laws such as the EU CSDDD. Of course, the devil is not so much in the detail, but I would say the devil is more in the implementation and transposition phase. So now that the policy-making process is over, I think there is still quite a lot of work to be done to ensure that this leveling of the playing field and harmonization will be maintained as we move into implementation and transposition. But the hope is that we're also going to get that out of those laws. I think it's clear that those laws, because we're moving from the voluntary space to the mandatory one, I think that those laws will also help to elevate the topic of sustainability due diligence high on companies' agenda. And I think we need this level of sort of awareness and also commitment from the top to really drive change on the ground. Of course, those laws, because they are laws and they really try to translate voluntary commitments into legal requirements, they are for this very nature also ambitious, and they will come with challenges. If I can mention just, I think, a couple of challenges that we see when talking to businesses. One is definitely the supply chain visibility. How do I move beyond first-tier suppliers where I have maybe contractual relationship? How do I make sure that there is awareness built also with my suppliers, that they do understand the benefit of engaging. I can also mention purchasing practices, a topic that I think is very known to many companies, but still somehow it remains the elephant in the room. So there are some challenges, but I always also want to look at the other side of the coin, so to say, and think of opportunities. I think that those laws are also going to offer quite a number of opportunities, notably sustainability due diligence should be regarded as a long-term investment. I think if at the beginning maybe companies are overwhelmed and feeling that this is maybe too much of administrative burden, I'm really hopeful that with time companies will begin to see that those laws will also offer opportunity to have greater strategic insights into how, for instance, products are made, where products are coming from, what kind of actors are involved in my supply chain. The same goes with reporting. I think there is a lot that can be said in terms of the benefit from being a bit more transparent about the work that you do. So hopefully sustainability due diligence will become a long-term investment, or will begin to be seen as a long-term investment. I think what's also clear is that companies will not have to do all this alone. Collaboration really plays a central role in due diligence. If we take the case of CSDD, just to mention one example, there is a clear role that is attributed to industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives in supporting companies with due diligence. If we look at the appropriate measures, collaboration also features as one appropriate measures that company could take depending on how they see the best appropriate course of action. So I anticipate somehow that there is going to be more opportunities for collaboration between different actors along the supply chain, between maybe governments and the private sectors, between sustainability initiatives. So I'm very hopeful that we're gonna see the benefit of those laws also through the lens of collaboration and building on good work and good effort that have already been done voluntarily by many businesses. And maybe in the interest of time, I would leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to you, Valentina. I mean, from the key points that have stayed with me from your presentation is first that many companies have been doing this voluntarily. So these new regulations are a call for engagement to take action. And there's a huge opportunity for more collaboration across the different actors, governments, companies, different stakeholders. There are also opportunities to view sustainability and elevate it as create more commitment to drive change, which of course is also welcome. But there are also some challenges, and you provided the perfect segue to the next part of the discussion, because now we want to discuss the challenges. And you mentioned supply chain visibility, you mentioned how to raise awareness about the need to share information and benefit from this engagement and change the purchasing practices. But before turning to the second part that will focus on challenges, perhaps we want to hear from the audience, and we're going to launch a poll, because we would like to know what are your thoughts? What are the challenges for complying with various due diligence regulations? According to you, what is the key challenge? Is it the complexity of managing diverse regulatory requirements? Is it the lack of resources and capacity for thorough compliance? Or perhaps difficulty in collecting or reporting reliable data to comply, or the increased costs associated with compliance efforts, or lastly, challenges associated to identifying and engaging suppliers along the supply chain? I'm going to give you some time, and let's see what is the key challenge according to you. There are some that go tete-a-tete, they're going together. I'll give 1 minute. Let me end the poll and share the results. Thank you so much for participating. Are you seeing the result? I guess that now they are shared. So the one that got most votes is difficulty in collecting and reporting reliable data to comply. And this goes to the point that you raised, Valentina, about engaging with the different tiers of the supply chain. The next one is complexity of managing diverse regulatory requirements. So hopefully with the insight and our coming work, we will help the different stakeholders to address this issue and navigate better the different regulations. And then there's lack of resources and capacity for thorough compliance and monitoring, because definitely these regulations require a change in business practices. And then the last two are increased costs associated with compliance efforts, of course, and challenges associated to identifying and engaging with suppliers along the supply chain. So I thank you very much all for participating. And now I'll give the floor to Rupal, who will continue the second part of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Florencia, and thanks so much. Very interesting results to move us also to the next section of our discussion, where we have already talked about collecting data as a challenge and engaging with all the tiers in the supply chain. With that, I will move to Patrick, Mr. Patrick Owusu.
Thank you very much, Rupa,
Hi.
for
Hi.
having me.
Let,
Well,
let me
can you
introduce
hear
you
me
very
very well?
quickly. Yes.
Well, I'm Patrick Owusu. I'm the General Manager for Esunafo North Cooperative Cocoa Farmers and Marketing Union based in Ghana. I'm very grateful for having me here to express our opinion on this important issue that we are all discussing today. Well, coming from the smallholder point of view, for us as a fair trade certified organization and RA certified organization, EUDL is not quite new to us because of the way we've been working, because that has been part of our work, making sure that we do sustainable farming, where we respect the environment, respect human rights issues, and also issues relating to living income is also something that we focus on. But considering the challenges that we faced since this whole, EUDL started, has to do with the fact that the farmers generally are not well informed. I must say, because I'm not speaking for only our members, which are just 10,000 farmers. There are more farmers in Ahafo, Esunafo, in Ghana that do not belong to any cooperative. So if you are introducing such an important regulation, we need to factor all these vulnerable farmers who may be working on half acre or 1 acre or 2 acre farm. We need to consider all their interests in rolling out these kind of important regulation. So I believe that it is not late, but we need to do more in terms of making sure that all actors get involved in making sure the farmers understand the concepts, because understanding alone will promote their compliance. Because if I don't understand the whole concept, to be difficult for me to comply, because many farmers who do not belong to this group don't even know the idea behind the whole EUDL. They don't know what it is. They may interpret it anyhow. So we need to get down to these vulnerable farmers who may not belong to organized group like Esunafo, so that all of them will know their roles, their responsibilities, and everything that they have to do to make sure they all comply. Farmers should not see EUDL as a punishment. They shouldn't see it as an additional cost to them, because whether we like it or not, farmers are already in a very worse situation. Their living income is very poor. They are faced with high cost of living. So if we are introducing such an important regulation, we need not to impose any additional cost on them. Else, some might even stop even the farming, because originally they are not really earning so much out of the business. So if you are introducing this regulation, we need not to, lose sight of the fact that the smallholder farmers are very, very important. So that is the first thing I want to, state here. And secondly, I would like to also talk about the fact that we need to define the roles very well. Who is doing what and who is, overseeing what. It's like we in Ghana, the whole concept has been led by COCOBOD. But I must admit that COCOBOD alone cannot do it without collaboration from all stakeholders, civil societies, the LBCs, all the value chain actors. Everybody must get involved. So we need to make sure that all these actors get to know what is entailed in the EUDL and what role is she going to play. For instance, we in SUNAFO, this program has increased our cost because we have to reach out to farmers through community-wide sensitization, through rigorous education, which under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have incurred those costs. But in spite of an additional cost, it didn't add any premium to us. Like the premium we are receiving is still the same. So if you are imposing a regulation which is imposing a cost on me, meanwhile, you didn't factor in terms of increasing the premium that companies have to pay, that consumers have to pay, so that if you're a consumer and you want products to be produced in a sustainable environment, then you should be prepared to pay more, so that whoever is, producing that commodity will also make sure they do the right thing. So in as much as we want to ensure compliance, we need to make sure there is equity in terms of, how resources are distributed, so that we don't seem to punish a smallholder farmers and, organized group like a SUNAFO cooperative. And basically, I must also say that the cooperatives that have come together like a SUNAFO union that is implementing all these things, there are other local laws that we need to make sure that, it work according to what is on the paper, because we cannot ensure compliance when state institutions are not doing their work. If we are telling farmers to plant trees, we are distributing economic trees to farmers. Don't farm in the forest. Don't do this. Protect the, forest bodies. We are doing all these things, and the state may be looking on for unauthorized persons to attack the trees that we have planted. They cut down the tree without the knowledge of the farmer. They may, give a concession to, a person, a third party who doesn't even know anything about farming. He doesn't know the cost of farming, and he will just enter your cocoa farm and start doing what they want. So in doing this, we need to get government to make sure that they also do the right thing by making sure that they don't allow illegal activities to take place in these farming areas, because there are certain things are beyond the farmers. The farmer cannot do it on his own. So we need state institutions to be up and doing and to be transparent in what we are doing. And finally, you talked about transparency and accountability. It's very, very important to me, because I believe that smallholders, farmers need to know what goes on in this industry. Yes, it shouldn't just be they should comply this, they should do this. The value that this industry is creating, how equitable are we making sure that these smallholders are getting their fair share? How equitable are we making sure that farmers are well paid? We cannot demand for regulation compliance when a farmer in Northern America or any other part of the world is better than a farmer in Ghana or a farmer in Cote d'Ivoire. we need to see that all of us are equal. We are all producing our own commodity. So we need to ensure that what is good for a farmer in East Africa, what is good for a farmer in Northern America, wherever it is, farmer in Ghana, farmer in Cote d'Ivoire, farmers in Nigeria are equally enjoying the same. If you are able to do this, then we can boldly embrace this regulation. But if I'm a farmer and I feel that I'm not getting what I'm supposed to get, then there wouldn't be any motivation for such a farmer to even comply. So these are the things I want to put across, that in demanding compliance, we need to make sure that the system of cocoa business across the world should be transparent. Everybody should know what is being made and what is going to the farmer. The premium we are paying, the $240 by fair trade minimum price, RA also have a minimum price that they pay, which can be negotiated. I don't think should be looked at again, because I believe that that is not enough if you want to get the farmers to comply. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. The message is loud and clear. We need incentives for farmers. Everybody needs to work together. The information relaying aspect of it has to be very transparent, very clear in order for this to work in a good sense, to lead to really sustainability. So all points taken, and on the point of collaboration, maybe now is a good angle that we bring in somebody who's helping with the tools for compliance. We have Remy D'Annunzio with us from FAO. Remy is a forest officer at FAO. He's the technical lead for forest data partnerships in the forest monitoring and data platforms of FAO, and he focuses on improving, among other things, forest and land use monitoring via remote sensing. So Remy, we heard very clearly we need collaboration, we need tools, we need guidance for farmers. And you, for one, have been leading the WISP tool, which is what's in a plot, the tool. And there have been some instances that you have been using it. So I'm very keen on hearing how this has worked up until now. What are the things you keep in mind from the farmer's perspective, from business perspective? How has it been, and what lies next for tools like WISP going forward?
Thank you very much, Rupal. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, all good.
Okay. So first, thank you for having me and allowing us to discuss a little bit in this panel. I think it's a very interesting discussion, also very timely, with recent news on the phase-in postponement of the UDR and the upcoming of the CS-DDD. All this really makes sense. I also really appreciated the intervention from Patrick and raising the voice for smallholders and the necessity to have more clarity and guidance on what's needed, the tools for compliance, and plus all the background on equity that's there. I would just like to take one step back on where we come from and maybe echo what Valentina was mentioning on the transition from voluntary approaches to curb deforestation and forest degradation, and the role that FAO has played. So I'm working in the forestry division of FAO, and we have been supporting voluntary approaches, those mentioned by Valentina, for the past 15 years. In particular, the REDD+ scheme, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, developing robust, transparent forest monitoring systems in as much as possible open source, so that they could be adopted by producing countries with as little cost as possible, and producing data that is fully transparent in the way that it is fully reproducible. So we've been really insisting on this over the past 10 years, 15 years. And now we see an emergence of those regulatory mechanisms that are taking precedence on those voluntary approaches. The interesting thing about the solutions that have been developed, and it's not only FAO, it's a wide range of stakeholders, is that those solutions can relatively easily be adapted. And we now are reinforcing them to support the development of tools that support zero deforestation value chain, and support compliance within those. So we heard about the constraints that those regulations pose. We haven't heard so much about the mechanism that were put in place. I'd just like to recall that at the last COP with UNFCCC last year, the Team Europe Initiative Zero Deforestation Hub was launched with a couple of programs. The technical facility of the TEI is one of them, led by EFI. Another one is the SAFE program, Sustainable Agriculture for Forest Ecosystems. And within this program, the Forest Data Partnership and the Aim for Forest program, which are two programs funded by the US and the UK. FAO has been working with many different partners, WRI, NASA Survey, Google, Unilever, to build open source solutions that help produce this relevant forest monitoring information to support the specific part of the regulation which we show in the first poll that you raised, which is the geospatial data. So one of the common points among all those regulations is the actual need for geolocation information in a consistent, transparent way. And we really tried to support this. So the question we wanted to address with WISP is, how do you assess the likelihood of deforestation in any given plot of land to support compliance requirement? And how can you do that freely in the most transparent way using public data sets and without having to pay anything? So there are, I'm going to go a little bit technical here, but I hope it's as clear as possible. But there are very many publicly available Earth observation datasets, maps, that provide data on forests, on land use, on tree cover, on how those things change. One of the issue around the availability of this data is the multiplicity of this data. And this is very well underlined in the Insight paper. So again, congratulations on that one. I think it's really interesting. We see that there are many solutions and many different products that are there. And those maps, they often diverge at pixel level for plenty of reasons, because they use various definitions, because they have different classification systems, because there's always small errors in automatic maps. What's interesting is that if you look at the plot level, at the farm level, even small farm, we actually see much more convergence between those products. And we see that different land cover maps, even if they have like differences at the pixel level, if you look at them at a slightly larger scale, they actually provide a consistent story in terms of how much tree cover there is inside, how much forest, if there are commodities around, and we can actually reconcile those products. So that's what we call convergence of evidence, and that's what we have developed through the WISP approach. So WISP stands for what is in that plot. And again, it's at the plot level that we believe we can reach the consensus between the different products. And we combine those land cover layers to produce information on land use. So your question, so this is where it comes from. This is how we built it. It's fully open source. It's fully published. The initial response we have from users is actually quite positive. So the convergence of evidence approach is supported by the Team Europe Initiative technical facility. They also provided interesting insight on the use of geospatial data for due diligence. I encourage you to look at that, and maybe I can put the link in the chat. We have a number of institutions that are using the deforestation risk assessment flow we are providing. I would just like to mention the World Trade Organization, International Trade Center, developing the deforestation free trade gateway, and they propose WISP as one of the potential pathways to assess the risk of deforestation at plot level. We also have a commentary paper that will be co-signed by different institutions in the Forest Data Partnership, which is coming up soon, so stay tuned. And I'm happy to elaborate more, but maybe for the sake of time, I stop here.
Thanks so much, Remy, and congratulations on all the good work. Points also taken, but one thing that I'm taking from this conversation is that, which we have been discussing within ISC, that there is multiplicity of data, and not just within plot mapping, multiplicity of data in terms of how people use different tools and complying with different things. And that brings us to the very last speaker of the panel. We have with us Christopher Schwarz from South Pole, who is a Global Associate Director, Agricultural Value Chains team in South Pole. He's a professional forester by training, but has worked in multiple areas in sustainability. And Christopher, for you, I know you've worked with sustainability standards before and also uncovered how they can be, some sort of interoperability between those two. So very curious to learn from all this discussion that we have ongoing, how can existing tools be used or not, maybe? Do we need to start from ground up, or is there some sense of interoperability? What is the best solution now going forward in the sense to not reinvent the wheel?
Thank you very much. Before I answer your question, I give you a really brief answer after that. I quickly want to thank all the speakers that went before. I was rapidly taking notes. I've learned a lot. I was a month out on vacation. It seems already new tools popped up on the horizon. So it is a world in especially corporate responsible or sustainability efforts in general that has never had more guidance and tools and standards and directions and regulations as we have right now. So this is a little bit, I'm really glad that there's so much, it's not for the lack of support. It is maybe complexity as we see in data. That is one element where we still need to do some work, but yeah. Quickly to give you an answer, do companies need to start from scratch and develop something in-house, or do they can rely on credible guidances and tools and mechanisms that they already exist? Short answer is yes. There is a multitude of tools. Some are more credible, some are more effective, some are more geared towards certain commodity supply chains, and others are more general. So companies, depending on their own profile in terms of which environmental and social negative impacts can they cause or is possible to do their business action to happen, they need to take and find the right tools. So just a couple key messages before I go into some examples. And before I actually go in there, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit ahead of myself, is I've seen a message by, I think, one of the participants in the chat calling out the fantastic idea and the really, really valuable input that Patrick has provided us from the producer side. In particular with due diligence laws that, as you already said, supply chains is without engaging your supply chains, you cannot conduct due diligence and you will never be compliant with any regulations that ask you to do so. And in your supply chains, it all starts, and usually where most of the environmental negative impacts occur are in the beginning of the supply chain, where the raw material is being produced, extracted, manufactured. So I'm really, really glad we have someone here that represent these interests and sides. And also I would like to echo that message again, is the inclusion of those actors in your efforts, and not in the design of the policy, but in the actual efforts and in the benefits that can lead, that we can achieve through proper due diligence work. So one last thing is we cannot just trickle down the expenses of sustainability efforts. The profits also need to trickle down. That was the core idea, and I can only echo that message. All right, so I've been working pretty much since 15 years in the responsible procurement and sales of natural raw commodities, natural raw materials in particular. Timber and paper is one of my key sectors, but we also work much in other forest risk commodities. I work for a company called South Pole. For those that do not know South Pole is one of the largest climate consultancy companies, and we really work at the intersection of climate and nature. And what we've seen more and more over the last years is, as my opening sentence already says, is there is seldom we have never seen before so much action and movement in the private sector when it comes to investing and investigating and investing into their sustainability efforts, in particular in their Scope 3 supply chains. This is largely driven by regulations that we see popping up left and right. I'm very grateful for this, as well as also internal investor and stakeholder pressures. So it's not just, it is called voluntarily, but sometimes it is not so voluntarily, or at least less than it used to be. And out of this push, we see more and more tools and resources emerging that companies, I highly recommend companies to use those. The thing is, one thing that speaks against developing in-house solutions is not only it's very complex. So as we already have seen in your poll, which is a great idea to have in the middle of a session, is the challenge is to understand the regulation, plus the hopefully short timeline for EUDR to be applicable. Where is there time and resources to develop in-house tools? Not only that, in-house tools tend to be less credible or perceived less credible as external tools. And most importantly, and that is I think really the low-hanging fruit of why you should use external tools versus internal tools is commonality and alignment of approaches. It sounds very theoretical and very complicated, but we only achieve, because the supply chain consists usually out of actors that have little to do with each other than their business transaction. We need to measure with the same tools and the same metrics and the same. We cannot compare oranges with bananas, and in the end, we have a fruit salad. So we would like to see companies using the same approaches for developing their policies, data gathering, risk assessment, risk mitigation, and reporting. Same tools, same data, same KPIs across sectors. Only then we can really see whether we make progress or not. Or is it yet just another reporting effort companies have to go through? So this is my case why we should be using existing tools. We've already interestingly presented a very interesting tool that's useful for the monitoring and verification of your actions at level of origin. Unfortunately, there's much out there that we can use already. One key thing, in particular me as a forester, I work mostly on deforestation, due diligence and on the topic of deforestation. Two key frameworks that really help companies, and I advise anyone after you've diligently studied and reviewed the EUDR and the CSDDD, after you finish those two documents, which is an easy weekend read, I highly recommend to you to look at the two resources that is provided. Number one, by the Accountability Framework Initiative, AFI, for those that have not heard it. And what organization most of us have heard is the OECD. And the OECD provided two guidelines that are really helpful. One is the responsible conduct for businesses that describe high-level due diligence processes, and there is a particular one on non-deforestation. These are really the frameworks that provide companies already with the wording and how they commit to non-deforestation in their operations and supply chains. Then data, and this is really something I want to spend a minute or two on, is key. So data, most of the companies do not own their data, but they're heavy reliant on their supply chains. And this is what we've seen, also confirmed in the poll, is that this is the biggest challenge. So not only my supply chain is super complex, but my actors in my supply chain barely know the data points that I'm talking about. So it is really a complexity and an awareness challenge that I'm not sure whether we can manage by December. However, there are organizations that have done really great work when it comes to supply chain information, supply chain data. So organizations like Trace and EcoVadis, and there's a newly emerging alliance of the Risk Information Alliance that provide companies not only with the critical risk data, but also verified data. So depending on the data needs, do not, before you start to set out, we need to gather supply chain data from our suppliers, investigate those organizations that can provide you already with your starting point of the data. As well as I really highly recommend is actively, and not just become member, but actively participate and push your stakeholder, your sector initiatives, such as any multi-stakeholder platform that you are hopefully member of. One example, what I've seen rather recently is in conversations that the World Cocoa Forum is having, is that they've provided guidance to their suppliers of what data points are to be gathered, to be evaluated, gather the same data points, and share that with other members. Since we all know in some supply chain, whether it may be rubber, maybe cocoa, maybe coffee, these supply chains are not so diverse. So usually we tend to buy from the same producers over and over again. So why not use the data? So I really, this is probably one of the low-hanging fruits. If I would be in the chair of any group or head of sustainability, this would be my first thing. Because data gathering, data validation is an expensive effort and the biggest risk behind that. And another two elements I would quickly like to highlight is risk management and the monitoring and reporting and verification. So risk management is where we identify and assess risk and manage or reduce the risk that we have identified. For that, again, I would like to highlight the AFI as well as the OECD guidelines that really provide a lot of guidance on companies. How am I to assess risk and which options do I have to mitigate risks? And there's one secret sauce and secret tip I would like to give everyone. This is my personal go-to resource to find really helpful mitigation actions. This is the Organization Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC. The FSC has many years in advance already developed frameworks for assessment of national risks of deforestation in particular, but also illegality. Many of the key producing countries have an own national risk assessment done by the FSC, several hundred pages long. This is one of the most extensive resources that I have that I can use to understand risks in environmental and social risks in key raw material production regions. And not only that it identified risk, but they also to provide you with key actions you can take to control those risks. So if you are working on those two topics, make sure that you, after this call, go onto the website, find the national risk assessment for the country that you source most of your company materials from, and investigate their findings. It is very helpful. And lastly, on the MRV part is I think the challenge right now when it comes to identifying your tool to do monitoring and verification of origin performance, so performance of your producers at the level of farm or plantation, is the number, the size of choices that we have nowadays. I think on my last count, we were close to 500 different remote sensing organizations. They do more or less the same work. Some do better work than others, of course. I don't want to oversimplify this, but it is really not for the lack of data or for the lack of choice. It's a jungle of choices that you have. So in summary, really, how am I on time? I wasn't really looking on the time, I'm sorry. I'm good, okay, good. So really in summary, if we look at the 6 key steps that make due diligence, and there are various frameworks, some call it 5, some call it 3, some call it 6. I call it 6 now. Target setting, data gathering, risk assessment, risk mitigation, monitoring, reporting. For all of these elements are existing tools and guidances out there and that are designed for companies, even for particular commodity supply chains to use and review. So in conclusion of my input, deforestation and legality, also human rights, I would say, are probably the most mature sustainability topics when it comes to the existing tools that are credible, recognized methods. They are internationally used across various sectors, and data points with most of these methods are aligned with. Something just to highlight again, my internal message: do not develop this in-house by yourself. Again, time, expenses, but mostly commonality and alignment is key. And one last thing I would like to say is in my engagement with companies and explaining them the expense of what is required, so the expense in terms of the amount of work that is required to build or develop a due diligence system in-house. Some companies can do this. It is daunting. It is, especially for a lot of companies that have, for those which due diligence is a paradigm shift. So I talk about some of the raw material traders. They are not used to ask these questions to suppliers. They're interested in price and quantity or maybe quality, but sustainability and really driving into data and in quality data is something that they're not very keen to hear. My last message here is not only that you should not reinvent the wheel, but do recognize that any dollar you invest into your due diligence work, meaning in your work to gather data, validate data, address data gaps, address risks you identified in that data, will all be conducive to the massive landscape of due diligence regulations that are coming our ways. This is not just a EU thing. And we already see incoming laws in the US. There are other major markets, whether India or China, all will be working on due diligence laws. Most of the companies have made climate commitments. You have made human rights commitments. You not only are required to meet the regulations, but you also are highly incentivized to meet your voluntary sustainability targets. These dollars that you invest into a proper due diligence system can be leveraged 5 times fold. So the money that you spend for an MRV service provider will be useful for a lot of other things and not just for EUDR.
Great.
So
Thank you so much.
I leave it with this little bit stronger message as a reminder. I hope I covered and responded to your question.
Yes, wonderfully. Thank you so much, Christopher. A lot of talk. We are a very passionate bunch of people. We have been harping on the same thing. Don't reinvent the wheel. Use the existing data mechanism. Use the existing work. Build it up from ground up. If you don't have anything, but you have systems, use them. And in the interest of time and in the interest of this passionate conversation, I would still like to hand it over and leave some time for Q&A. Christina, over to you so we can have some nice answers from our panel.
Thank you so much, everyone. Very, very interesting conversation, very insightful, important points that all of you raised. I would like to just highlight a few, the complementary role that these due diligence regulations provide to existing tools. They build from previous experiences, the importance of the data management, data sharing, and of course, all the claims that Mr. Patrick shared with us, the importance to include those farmers or those producers that are the basis of many of the supply chains that are going to be eligible in this due diligence regulations, the importance to work with them, include them, and especially have incentives for their work. Let's go to Q&A because we have very interesting questions here, and thank you for the audience for being very active. Let's start with Matthew. To Matthew, there's a question to you, okay? Very interesting question. What do you say about the recurring critique that the EU regulations, part of the Green Deal, lack sufficient consultations with other stakeholders, not the least developing countries where companies, and in particular SMEs, with the struggles with compliance? And this echoes Patrick's comment that we heard later on. What are your views on this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And of course, Patrick did touch on this, and it was a really, really great contribution to hear. So it is a criticism that I have heard, an increasing criticism in recent months since the passage of the CSDDD. I can't really comment on the deforestation. I wasn't involved in negotiations on that one. But on the CSDDD, certainly it's a unilateral instrument, and therefore one of the difficulties that we've found has been the loudest voices, of course, were EU businesses in that debate, and especially in the latter phases when I think it's no secret that the legislation was up for debate and faced some opponents. So it is true that global South voices were drowned out in parts of that debate, but they certainly were present, and they certainly were something that we were considering all the way through the negotiations. I think the challenge now, and I know that the European Commission is definitely working on this, is now translating this into the external action of the European Union. It's not a trade instrument. It's a company law instrument within the European Union, but of course it has clear implications outside the European Union. One thing I'd like to stress is that the objective, of course, is not to have smallholders or individual producers having to comply. In fact, quite the opposite. There are actual safeguards within the CSDDD that say that companies taking a compliance approach, a tick box, you must fulfill these contractual obligations, are at risk of liability. They will be held liable if there are failings there. So any company that is sort of going to their individual suppliers and forcing this compliance-based approach, that's not compliant with the CSDDD. that would likely not be compliant. It's meant to be a partnership. It's meant to be working in partnership, and of course there is a role for the EU to provide the support there, but also the large companies themselves. And it's part of doing proactive due diligence is not just taking this box tick approach to those questions, and that is definitely within the CSDDD text. But yes, I would say there's more work to be done, and definitely open from our side always to hear the concerns, but also some of the best practices on the ground of how this is working. Okay.
Exactly. Thanks very much, Matthew. Okay, so it's clear there will be safeguards for those that are smallholder enterprises, small scale enterprises, but and there's a recognition of this unilateral approach. But I like to bring Patrick to the conversation, because you actually mentioned something very interesting now. What are the best practice, to include these smaller scale actors in information sessions, in consultations? So, Patrick, you provided an excellent, participation early on, and you mentioned that the farmers that are in situation that are more vulnerable, that they're not even lucky to be part of cooperatives and associations. What would be the best practice to engage with them in terms of not only, policymakers in a potential consultation on how they can better support their practices, but also the businesses? What would you expect of our best practices to better?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Patrick. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you please hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you. Otherwise, we can hear you. Otherwise, we move to the next question and we bring you in. Can you speak up, please? Okay, perhaps let's come back to Patrick. Perhaps there might be some internet connections there. So, Matthew, a follow-up question on this. How do you mentioned, we discussed earlier that at the moment there has been some unilateral measures with the aim to have at some point a global framework, that can make due diligence more universal practices. How do you value the risk of countries currently exporting to the EU, assessing the new compliance costs too high, and instead decide to reroute the export to countries with lower requirements? Is the formal, the so-called leakage that we have heard about? How do you perceive this?
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. I think it might be, I see the question in the chat, and I don't know whether it relates to the EUDR or the CSDDD. From the CSDDD perspective, there is a clear safeguard there, which I don't think this is going to happen, because it is, of course, not about imports and exports. It's about your company making a certain turnover in the European Union. So it's not actually possible to escape, let's say, the legal obligations of the CSDDD by rerouting how you enter into the European market, or just avoiding the European market. I mean, without withdrawing from the European market entirely, it wouldn't be possible to circumvent the CSDDD. It's behavior rules. It's not a customs instrument. It's not stopping things at borders. It just doesn't work like that. So if you're making the same turnover as a European-based company in the European markets, you will be caught by the CSDDD rules. So in that sense, it's not alike to some of the other, like the forced labor ban, where clearly there might be a risk of leakage. I don't know, but on the CSDDD, that it doesn't really work in the same way. No.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for the clarification. Yep. So is the directive, the CDDD directive, it targets the operations and the behaviors of the company and value chains, and the import and export flows does not intervene. Okay, very good. Let's go to another question to Valentina, and I would like to come back later to Patrick. For many of these new regulations, there is a demand from the business community for clear guidance on how to implement these regulations. So what level of guidance is likely to come forth? And what role does industry have in figuring out what is deemed acceptable? So what level of guidance business expect and need? Can you give us your thoughts on this?
Thank you so much for the very good question, and I think it's a key aspect, let's say, of the implementation, right? You have lawmaking, you have the law that is written in Brussels, then there is the transposition in the case of the CSDD because it's about a directive. But then I think you also need clear guidance from the European Commission, both to businesses as well as to member states. So we'll have to then work with enforcing the requirements nationally. I think the CSDD does a very good job at listing quite some extensive guidance that will need to be produced by the European Commission somewhere in 2027. If I'm not mistaken, it's there are different set of guidance between January and July 2027, and they concern all sorts of things such as the due diligence duty or conflict affected and high risk areas, even climate transition plan. So there is really a lot on the plate of the European Commission. And from what I understand, the European Commission is going to consult stakeholders broadly. So there is an opportunity. So if you, the question also asks, what role does industry have in figuring out what is needed? I think there is going to be an opportunity for industry, but for stakeholders more broadly to input into this forthcoming public consultation, which is, from what I understand, expected somewhere in October or let's say autumn this year, to really give feedback to the European Commission in terms of what it is that is actually needed. What we are doing at Amfori, because as I said, we work with businesses, we're currently conducting a survey, asking them about their level of preparedness, what is it that might be needed in terms of priority, and clearly there is some guidance that will be needed in the space of stakeholder engagement, some guidance that will be needed in the space of how do you engage with suppliers beyond contractual relationship, but also sector-specific guidance, because this piece of legislation, CSDD, will apply to companies operating in any given sector. But it is very important that I think there is also some clear guidance, building, of course, on guidance that is already out there. And other speakers talked about, of course, the OECD guidance on responsible business conduct. There is also sector-specific guidance by the OECD. So I would say for businesses, it's very important that whichever guidance is produced by the European Commission, it builds on relevant good practice and international standards. So it's not, again, about not reinventing the wheel, but making it clear, of course, for the specificities in this case of CSDD. And I would argue also that the sooner the guidance is published, the better. This way companies can start to roll out processes to prepare.
Okay, very good, Valentina. So it seems that there is already a good amount of tools and initiatives out there to support business in that direction. I would like to see whether Patrick is with us, because this issue of guidance is very important for those producers that have less capacities and less opportunities, to connect with tools, with cooperatives. Patrick, are you there?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me now. My network was quite bad.
Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead. What is the support that you imagine these farmers are more vulnerable need to access in order to comply with these best practices? I think we lose him in and out.
Well, thank you very much. I think can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, I made a suggestion. I made a suggestion that we need to have a very simple manual which try to detail the whole concept of EUDR so that it can be accessible in different languages, which farmers, either by pictorial and other by local, making it in pictorial form or whatever. In our area here, a lot of farmers are not well educated so much. So you need to bring the education to the level of their knowledge. So I suggest that we need to have a manual whereby it's accessible by all stakeholders, especially like smallholder organizations like ours, so that we know the whole concept and what is expected of a farmer, so that it becomes clearer. But we have a situation whereby you'll be there, Cocobody invite you, EUDR workshop, this EUDR, that, EUDR this. And there is no clear manual which define what is expected of farmers. So I also recommended that we need to have a desk, a special desk, be it at Cocoa Board or an independent desk, which can be established across all regions or maybe cocoa district, whereby a farmer can just walk in there and access any information he wants to access. And if he has any question, he can go there and ask those questions. But currently, I have not seen that kind of, that kind of structures in our locality. So if not, we are organized group and our members can run to us in terms of such information. Ordinary farmers don't know where to go when they need any information. So we need to make all these things and make sure we educate farmers about all those structures.
Excellent, Patrick. Very good point. So decentralized services, this is what is needed, that really arrive close to the farmers. Exactly. So Matthew, pick that up. Yeah, excellent. And we are very close to, I want to just ask, following on that point that Patrick mentioned, to Valentina or Christopher, how about incentives? We know, Patrick mentioned, and ISD, we also have examined that, the margins in some of the agricultural value chains in particular stayed a lot in the downstream value chain, like manufacturers, traders, retailers. And we know, Patrick mentioned, that farmers need more incentives to adopt these practices and comply with regulations. How do you see businesses, value chain actors, the willingness to share cost and pay more farmers about the benefits of adopting good practices that are good to the environment? Valentina, Christopher, maybe Christopher, can you go ahead, please? How do you see this willingness?
Yeah, I also may want to make some space in terms of my co-panelist wants to also add to this. So first of all, I would like to echo what was mentioned earlier. So the legal requirement to meet EUDR is with the operator or the trader, not with the producer. So where the requirement is and the responsibilities are, there should be the expenses and the costs. It's not the cocoa producer in Ghana that chooses that its cocoa bean ends up in Europe. So this is ethically a rather straightforward answer. So that is largely the responsibility is the one who decides to import it into the European Union. Incentivification is a rather straightforward conversation. It's a rather easy one I have to say, in particular when I speak with procurement and traders. And that is more true in cocoa and natural rubber supply chain, coffee also, all the commodities where there right now is a scarcity of compliant materials. So the companies are very much interested in ensure what we call commodity availability or sourcing availability and continuously, so for the next coming years. So this is where the companies already I usually see a lot of white in the eyes when I speak to procurement agents when they realize how little of the global volumes actually are compliant with what the EU requires them to do. So the incentivization rather is, do you want to be able to sell your coffee? Do you want to meet your next year's target? That is a very strong incentivization for companies. The sharing of the expenses, however, is something where companies are very much disconnected from the origin, from the production, in particular where we look into commodity markets that are mostly traded through futures markets, which is the coffee, which is the rubber. So there is a very strong disconnect between what companies pay and what trickles down in the end to the producer. If I would be the company going forward and I would like to ensure that my coffee products are being sold in the EU, I would go away from those commodity markets, ensure my own supply chains, make long-term commitments to gentlemen like Patrick, large cooperatives, secure them and pay them what it's needed to make so they can gather, collect, and validate the data that I report in. So if I just explain it like this, I don't need companies to incentivize much. This is a logical flow. If I'm a procurement or a commodity trader that is worth its money, that's what I will be doing. So sorry, I'm getting very...
Excellent point, Christopher. I think there is a value proposition there for these type of operators and cooperatives when providing the data and collecting the data. For the sake of time, we have a last question that I will invite Remy to ask. What will be the impact of this new type of regulation on smallholders? Will be direct consequence implications? I know you want to have a word on this, so Remy, please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just quickly, and that echoes what Christopher was saying. Geospatial data is the new crop, and we don't want that new crop to become an extractive commodity. So yes, the responsibility of and the charge and the costs of compliance is on operators, who are the ones who are supposed to comply, but it still has a cost on smallholders, because we see divergence of value chains and operators actually starting to source outside. So there is an impact on smallholders that is not direct, but that is certain. And I think we as a global community have a responsibility of providing the tools. There is the technology, it's relatively easy, it's very easy to actually geolocate anything today. And I think what's missing is actually awareness. As Patrick was mentioning, this material is crucial for those regulations, more specifically like UDR, which have those components. But if this is done, if this material exists and is being acknowledged and largely shared in many different languages and so on and so forth, then there is a chance that geospatial data becomes part of the digital identity of farmers, and they don't become dependent on it. And they are actually able to add value to their commodities by having this, and they know that it's fundamental, and they are able to continue producing those beans that go to the market without necessarily having to choose whether they go or not. So I think it's an important component, and yeah, I think this is one of the crucial points on smallholders.
Excellent. So again, it's another very good view with regards to the value that data the data that farmers collect can provide to them as part of supporting other operators complying with these due diligence regulations. So thanks very much. We are really on time. It's 10:30. We had a very excited conversation. Thank you, everybody, for your views, your value, your transparency, and for joining us, and all the audience who had excellent questions, and they were very engaged through the process. So this is a first activity for us at ISD. We're going to continue working on the diligence regulations and make this landscape more accessible to different actors, in particular smaller scale enterprises and farmers, and supporting the value proposition for them. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and we look forward to connecting with you very soon. Thank you.